Hi.
Yay!
Now we're getting somewhere. Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Legendary Performances. I'm Pat Harrigan, and I'll be sharing this stage with guest of honor Matthew Kessen. So we're going to give you an hour or so of spoken word performances of a variety of types. So if you don't like one, well, just hang on, because we'll do something different in a few minutes. So we're going to start by introducing Matt Kessen.
Thank you so much. Now here's something for you all to get used to, which is me moving this up and down every single time. Okay. Yay! Yay! There we go. Hi. I'm Reverend Matt, and the Celtic people of olden days believed that some seals could take off their skins and transform into humans. And because of the nature of the American public school system, I feel I should make one thing clear: that's wrong. They were wrong about that. These shapeshifters were called selkies in Scotland and roan in Ireland, and sometimes all seals were selkies, also wrong, and sometimes only some of them were, which would lead to stories about seal hunters accidentally killing or wounding selkies, which could only be told apart from regular seals by the selkies' especially big, deep, watery eyes. Which, if we accept seal hunting as a thing, is admittedly difficult to check for. The selkies would then avenge themselves on humanity by sinking boats and calling up terrible storms, because we need to be given reasons in stories not to murder sentient seals, because humanity is the best. Apart from this power, the shape-changing, the selkies were wise in the ways of medicine, could enable humans to breathe underwater, and could foretell the future, but nobody really cared about any of this, because in their human forms, selkies were physically attractive. And so, the selkies were targets for lonely humans. They tried to mind their own business, generally only coming ashore to dance in the moonlight on full moons, or during midsummer, or every 9 days, or something. But humans couldn't leave well enough alone, and what with the attractive at all, as with the seal hunting, we were usually the instigators, not always, rarely selkie men were described as womanizers, interested in human women, and in these stories, or at least the surviving ones, everything is heteronormative, of course, though usually they were only interested in one-night stands. Occasionally, one would marry a human woman, though it would usually be a short-lived union, possibly because one part of the couple was a seal from the ocean. If you didn't want to just try your luck on the seal man dating scene, the bars are gross, you guys. There were more supernatural options. If you were a woman, and you simply wanted a tryst with a selkie, you could cry 7 tears into the sea at night. That sounds great, doesn't it? People say it's hard to be a woman in Western society, but just cry into the sea when you're lonely. What is the big deal? I'd love to tell you that the stories get better for women when men want selkie brides, but boy, they don't. These stories go like this. When a man wanted a selkie for a wife, he would wait until they came ashore to dance on a beach, and then he would steal one of their discarded seal skins. The selkie whose skin it was would then be compelled to do whatever that man wanted, and so he would have her marry him. And nice work, dude. I don't know why you couldn't get a human wife. You seem like a catch. In spite of this being the most spectacularly revolting behavior I've ever heard of in my life, the selkie would be a loving and supportive spouse, and the couple would often have many children. But inevitably, at some point, sooner or later, the selkie would find her hidden skin, and sometimes her children would find it and ask their mother what it was. And she would take the seal skin, yes, and she would take the seal skin and return to the sea immediately, usually without so much as a word. Sometimes she would spare just enough time to give her children a brief, sad look, but that was all. And that was the story of the selkie bride. This is an example of a recurring folkloric motif, the supernatural bride. In these stories, a man gains some sort of supernatural entity for a wife through luck or manipulation or a dating site, and then, because of his failing to follow the rules that such entities live by, or some other alteration of the deal, he loses her. Sometimes, especially in the olden days, these are taken as entirely sad stories in which women are depicted as supernatural because women are weird and scary. I hope there aren't any women here tonight. That would be a nightmare. But I don't understand this interpretation. It's hard not to take the sulky bride story as one of triumph. Bittersweet with the children, perhaps, but a woman in an entirely coerced situation gets her own back and gets out of it. Her speed and silence in doing so, demonstrating how badly she wanted to go. Better, of course, that she had never been enslaved in the first place, but as stories go, it still beats crying into the sea. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for joining me tonight as I present some brief remarks on the life and work of the 20th century science fiction writer Richard Stern. I am here on behalf of the good folks at Black Phantom Books, for whom I am acting as general editor for their new hardback series of Mr. Stern's work, which has been out of print since his death in 1996. This is a rare and wonderful opportunity for me. I was a boy of 12 when I bought my first paperback Stern, his 1975 novel, The Man from Fabled A, at the now regrettably lost Uncle Hugo's science fiction bookstore in Minneapolis. I was attracted, it must be admitted, by the lurid cover, illustrated, I believe, by either Frank Frazetta or Boris Vallejo. Mr. Stern's covers invariably thronged with steroidal hunks and well-proportioned Martian ladies of the Deja Thoris variety. It was more than enough to earn my 75 cents, and the story inside put a spell on me that I have never shaken, and which led me to seek out as much of Stern's work as I could find, not always an easy task. Richard Stern, whose birth name was Dieter Sternlicht, was born in 1938 in Pacific Palisades, California. His father was employed at Caltech, and Stern claims to have been given his first pulp magazine, the May 1942 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, by none other than the famous rocket scientist and overall weirdo Jack Parsons. Stern remained a science fiction fan, but didn't try his hand at writing until he was 19 years old, encouraged by acquaintance Fritz Leiber, who helped him to place his first story in the December 1958 edition of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. That same year, Stern married his high school sweetheart Annie, to whom he had been long devoted. But Annie was a passionate believer in reincarnation and a practicing witch. The term Wiccan was not yet common. Beliefs which Stern did not share, and the marriage came under strain. Some sort of encounter with Annie's friend, the filmmaker Kenneth Anger, seems to have inspired in Stern a radical shift in perspective and lifestyle reevaluation. Very little is known about this, but whatever happened, their childless marriage dissolved in 1965, after which he moved to New York City, where he was briefly roommates with Thomas M. Dish, before he found the apartment in the East Village, where he would remain until his death. Throwing himself into the city's gay subculture in the company of Chip Delaney, at this time he also met Andy Warhol, who, enraptured by the pretty Stern, promised that he would make him a star. But Warhol was the last person to be able to do something like that. Andy collected and reflected stars and absorbed them into his own corpus, but he could never make a star. Stern was never painted by Warhol, and his film career was limited to a quick scene of him going down on Candy Darling that was cut from the final version of Chelsea Girls. The disappointment seems to have been profound. Stern complained to Delaney, "I guess I'm just not made of star stuff." Around 1976, he began to associate with the loose-knit group of Satanists, Crowleyites, and other esoterics that hung around the Magical Child bookstore in Chelsea, although he would always claim not to be an occultist himself, and that he observed the scene only to try to decipher what he called its man logic, by which he seems to have meant that he found it of anthropological interest. Nevertheless, it left at least one mark on him. At this time, he began frequently to repeat Aleister Crowley's famous dictum, "Every man and woman is a star." From this point on, that phrase turns up often in his letters and stories, although the reader will search in vain for many other magical signifiers in his work. Stern married again in 1980, and he and his wife Cass adopted a baby, Charlie, in 1992. He died in 1996 of unknown causes and was interred on a hillside near his parents' graves in Forest Lawn. I visited the site last year in the company of Cass and Charlie, and I can tell you that the view of the California sunrise is simply lovely. A full bibliography of Stern's work is not yet available, and in fact may never be possible. His publishing history is complex. When rights to a novel or story lapsed, Stern would often sell it to a different publisher, usually revised or slightly polished up. Or he would sometimes expand existing short stories to turn them into novels. And over the years, all of these works, some published under pseudonyms, moved in and out of print. In the 1970s, his books often included strong pornographic interludes, inserted at the behest of his publishers, which he would remove when selling them later in the mainstream market. In one especially extreme case, his very racy 1977 book, Universal Woman, was published in America to no acclaim whatsoever, but picked up and translated by a French publisher, after which the French version was translated into German by a German publisher, and ultimately translated back into English by Stern himself, and placed with a new American publisher under the title The Galactating Lady, whereupon it became his best-selling book to date. For someone writing at the height of avant-garde SF, Stern was considered rather old-fashioned even in his day. He wrote space opera, unapologetically but not exactly coherently. There were no efforts at cross-book uniformity, as with Heinlein's Future History series or Ben Bova's Grand Tour books. No recurring characters or elaborate continuity. Indifferent to character work, he was also little interested in technology or the other trappings of hard SF. His light-speed drives operate under the flimsiest of technological pretexts, and the tactics featured in his space battles make more sense when viewed as those of the tall ships from the age of sail somehow translated into outer space. His plots are composed of familiar elements: intergalactic wars, space-time traversal, clonings, mental transference, artificial intelligence, betrayals, love triangles, and noble sacrifices. And although the books are not discernibly racist or xenophobic, they also feature no women characters of real note, and partake of a mid-20th century mindset that modern readers may find a little alienating. His critics call his books rushed and their endings inconclusive, but I think that overlooks the undeniable narrative power in his best scenes, like the fire in the engine room in King Hydra, or the long cat-and-mouse sequence in the asteroid belt between the Earthers and the Ixtari in Watch Your Back. But just as any human being viewed in isolation can appear flawed and unfulfilling, Stern's books, perhaps individually unsatisfying, when considered as a whole, like the vast array of humankind itself, take on a more satisfying proportion. Stern's primary fascination was astronomy, and he had such an evangelical gift for explanation that even a reader like me, who couldn't tell you the difference between a Dobsonian reflector and a Dyson sphere, can find himself moved by the passion Stern brings to his prose when describing the spectacles of the universe. In the dark spaces between the stars, where someone like Lovecraft, who died the year Stern was born, saw dread and cosmic terror, Stern saw a realm of infinite hope and possibility. Over and over in his books, men stand on the bridges of starships or space stations and stare out at planets, meteor showers, black holes, aurorae, nebulae, and the like, and wonder. Human endeavor, tiny and fleeting as it is, can exist only in these vast empty spaces where it can grow and thrive, however evanescently. Perhaps most emblematic of this is the sequence in Parallax Shift, where Colonel Craig pilots his starship into the corona of a red giant so that the ship's murderously defective AI will no longer pose a danger to his escaping crew. As the life support systems fail and the light grows intolerable, the Colonel reflects that just as the particles that formed his body had a stellar origin at the moment of the Big Bang, so they will soon return to that discorporated state and that maybe at some unimaginable point in the future they will find themselves, some or all of them, together or apart, forming a new living body somewhere, a new life or consciousness maybe, a new something or someone. Every man and woman is a star, the colonel tells himself, and makes the old superstitious hand gesture that his Wiccan mother had taught him as a child, as the solar radiation reduces him to atoms. Some while ago, in a time of great personal isolation in which I was in sharp need of a project to occupy myself, I was approached by Charlie Stern, who proposed that I edit a new collection of his father's work. Because of my love for it, and also perhaps because Charlie, although an adoptee, is nevertheless the uncanny, spitting image of his father, such that I felt that I was talking to the man himself, to whom I could not possibly say no, I gratefully agreed. And so happily, after many delays and setbacks, this year Black Phantom will publish the first 3 volumes of the collected works of Richard Stern, complete with Varorium appendices, with another 3 planned and more to come if they meet with success. I hope they do, as Richard Stern is long overdue for his revival. Thank you again for your attention, friends, and blessed be.
Hi, I'm Reverend Matt, and today I would like to tell you all of the facts about tauntauns. Now, of course, there are a few facts about tauntauns with which everybody is familiar. The first of these is that they smell bad on the outside, and yet worse still on the inside. The first part of this is, in fact, canonically, because they excrete their bodily waste products through their skin, which is extremely important that you do not think about for even a second. The second part is due, of course, to the fact that all living creatures smell worse on the inside, except for the mynock, which for reasons unknown to biologists, have innards that smell like freshly baked cherry pie. The second really well-known fact about tauntauns is that they will freeze before you reach the first marker. There are those who have remarked on how unusual this is, that an animal should have evolved that freezes to death in its own environment whenever it should be troubled by nighttime. And in fact, tauntauns are recorded canonically to dig under the snow to spend the night or to sleep in Hoth's extensive cave systems, formed by both tectonic activity and the meteors that continually pelt the planet. Some scientists have claimed that this continual bombardment and/or the planet's inhospitable cold should make it impossible for complex life, such as tauntauns, to evolve on Hoth. But then over here are some guys with swords made of laser, so shut up. In any case, tauntauns are certainly not plentiful. One general of the rebellion was known to remark that the entire biome of Hoth could not, quote, fill a space cruiser, unquote, causing future Jedi Master Luke Skywalker to laugh politely. Those with a deeper knowledge of tauntauns will know that they are often referred to as snow lizards. Those with a deeper knowledge still will know that tauntauns are a fully warm-blooded species that bears live young, which they nurse with milk, making them lizards in much the same way that they are fish, or perhaps centipedes. It may perhaps be noted that they do have a layer of scales under their fur, and indeed their ears are simply large, swiveling scales, but if scales make you a lizard, then being a huge, sentient slug makes you a hut, which I suppose it actually does, and this comparison was not a very good one. Leaving such comparisons aside, however, tauntauns are surprisingly elegant creatures, combining features of dinosaurs and sheep into a remarkably seamless and natural-seeming whole. They follow the standard plan of vertebrate tetrapods, 4 limbs, 2 eyes on a head, etc., that has evolved over and over again on countless worlds. Again, scientists protest the odds of such a thing. And this time I will mention that a lot of agents of the galactic government used to be wizards. One way in which they do diverge from the standard body plan is in the possession of 4 nostrils. This, in fact, is the subject of some debate, almost as if facts about tauntauns had been arrived at arbitrarily by a variety of unrelated and underpaid fiction writers who were paying no attention to one another. One scholar states simply that the two pairs warm air in turns, leaving why there would be any point to that as an exercise for the reader. Another states that the larger pair breathes during periods of physical exertion, but at other times they seal up and the smaller filtered pair takes over, removing debris from the airstream. Sure. You bet. Other facts about tauntauns include that they make an amazing hamburglar sort of noise. They eat algae, fungus, and lichen. They use their horns for butting in contests for dominance or mates, the females competing for males. They will spit in the eyes of enemies, the spit freezing instantly and causing blindness. They travel in herds of 20 to 30. At that, I thought they were totally rad when I was 9, and also later when I was 48. One source states that, quote, their inner organs are packed close inside their skeletons to keep them safe from cold, as opposed to most animals whose internal organs just kind of slosh around. Also, the animal generally known as the tauntaun is in fact the common or giant tauntaun. There are fully 14 other species, including the glacier tauntaun, known for its high-pitched screech, and the climbing tauntaun, the smallest species. And I did not make any of this up, but the fact that somebody somewhere did means this is still a world worth saving. It is a myth that one rides a tauntaun by putting your legs through a trapdoor on its back. But this does bring us to the riding of tauntauns, which was of course perfected by the Rebel Alliance 3 years after the Battle of Yavin, unless that's been retconned. Using only females so that they would have no males to fight over, it is nevertheless reported that they were seen as ornery creatures, as though this were unusual behavior when you walk up to a wild animal and climb onto its back. They were nevertheless regarded as superior mounts to Hoth's other large life form, the wampa, which were more hostile, and also riding on them looked completely ridiculous. Nevertheless, praise is due these noble beasts for their vital role in the struggle to overthrow the Galactic Empire, a regime so brutal, hateful, and authoritarian that it is incredible that it should have been reborn just a few decades later in the form of the Trump president, the First Order. The First Order, sorry. If only fighting off fascism over and over again always had tauntauns.
Quite some time ago, maybe 15 years, in the midst of an otherwise unexceptional conversation, my late friend, the Lady Louise Forbes Hamilton, said to me, you know, water and air are much the same thing, really. The one is oxygen in a menage a trois, and the other is oxygen hosting an orgy. Now, Lady Forbes Hamilton was not a scientist by training, and her observation drew more upon her experience in London's West End society than molecular chemistry. That said, she recognized an indulgent smile when she saw one, as she saw mine on this occasion, and she was always prepared to go that extra mile to wipe it off. Darling boy, she said, distilling every bit of our 2-decade age gap into the words, I know more about all those little terms than you'll ever know, and that includes the words air and water. Whereupon she related to me a very strange story indeed. In the summer of 1969, Lady Forbes Hamilton, let me call her Louise, it was an intimacy we shared, among others. Louise attended the opening night performance of Peter Brook's new production of Marat Sade, starring Albert Finney, Terence Stamp, and Vita Tushingham. The play did not meet with her approval, but she consented to join the cast and crew at their after-party at a local pub, and later at an enormous 4-terraced stucco home in Belgravia. She never found out who owned the place. Very old money, she told me, by which I mean money about 3 times as old as your country. Anyway, She was drunk, of course, and also someone must have slipped something into her drink, she said, which was her personal code for having taken some drug she preferred not to admit to. So, absenting herself from the flirting and the chat, she stepped out onto one of the back balconies for some air. Behind the house, 4 stories below her, enclosed by high walls bordered by hedges, was a courtyard dominated by a wide, shallow pool of Cornish granite, with a bronze bathing Venus in the center. It brought her into a melancholy frame of mind. Only a week before this, Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones and a friend of sorts, had been found dead in his swimming pool. The splashing from the fountain was detectable only in the very center of the pool. From where Louise stood, most of the courtyard seemed mirror smooth, reflecting the facade of the house, bright white in the windless evening, some windows dark, some pale, with a small duplicate of her on the uppermost, which is to say furthermost, floor. But not mirror smooth, not exactly, because in it she could see the ripple marks of some small colorless fish here and there and here, otherwise undetectable, observable only by their wake. Then as she watched, the image of the facade began to break up prismatically, its white gleam drawing apart into its constituent colors, bright primary reds and blues and golds spreading across the surface of the water and upward into the third dimension of the courtyard. Then in the smoke from her cigarette, she seemed to see the same sort of fish-like rippling, and a moment later the air around her was full of it, as if some invisible school had swum through the world. Her perspective slipped, and the world was now riot with color. On the balcony she still stood, left hand pressed lightly to the exterior wall, but her body was somehow different, more lightly felt. Her hair floated. When she breathed, it was to inhale a surrounding substance like warm gelatin that soothed her lungs like aloe and invigorated like cocaine. Her cigarette unraveled into pieces and drifted away. She marveled at the rainbows around her. Without a doubt, she was now resident in the underwater reflection home. She turned and went inside with lightly bouncing steps. From far away, she saw people she knew at the far end of corridors and disappearing through doorways. Some seemed as if they would like to stay and greet her, but instead they nodded their regrets and left for pressing obligations. Others seemed to avoid her gaze entirely and dart away. Had she offended them? Made some grievous social faux pas? She hurried to catch up, but failed to find them in the corridors of colors. More recently, not really very long ago, when I visited Louise in the hospital, she reminded me again of this part of the story. At that point, the pneumonia was taking hold, and she had not yet been ventilated, so she was able to talk to me for half an hour, though it was hard on her. I suppose it was a premonition, she said. When you grow older, your friends and lovers leave you, and it does make one sink a little, as it were. Mark that, dear, and turn your face for a moment while I adjust this fucking thing in my nose. But that was later. In the story she had told me, at this point, a tall, handsome man approaches her. I should mention that in Lady Forbes Hamilton's stories, the men who approached her were invariably tall and handsome, and usually Mediterranean. But this was different, in a special way, she insisted. Was it Terence Stamp, I asked, since I have a long-standing boy crush on Terence Stamp? No, dear, it was not Terence. This one was more sinister and genteel, like Vincent Price. Yes, shush. She looked into his mesmerizing eyes. He laid a hand on her shoulder and pulled her closer, bringing his mouth to her ear, as if to whisper a secret. All around her, the world dazzled. Her heart pounded. He said to her, "Can I feel your tip?" "Oh, come on, Louise," I said. "I mean, really. That's how it is, my dear. Uplands, lowlands, or supernatural places, just randy men dotting the landscape like dandelions or beds of kelp. Don't tell me you're above it, my angel. I see you." I was insulted. "Did this story even ever happen?" "Oh, yes, of course it did," she said. "I've never lied to you." So I let him have a little rope, and then he walked me through the place, and it was really remarkable. I saw people I knew, or versions of them. I saw Catherine Deneuve swimming with a school of dolphins, and Mick Jagger dancing with clams. I heard Jane Birkin and Serge Gainsbourg composing something unspeakable, and I saw Enoch Powell naked in a cloud of whale blood. Somewhere in the background there was war. It was also very full of meaning. My dear, you're simply just too young. You can't understand. You had to be there. I didn't understand. Until the day she died, Louise insisted that this was no sort of parable, but the literal truth. Louise was level-headed about most things, but not about this. It had happened just as she said, she said. The next morning, she had woken up in Albert Finney's bedroom, fully clothed, she assured me, and she rang her sister to pick her up. But yes, my dear, there is an underwater world, spooky and supernatural, more colorful than our own, though, she admitted, the same in some respects. As above, sort of as below. Everything top to bottom, linked by a chain of many colors, she said, fixed somewhere up in the invisible, airless firmament, she supposed, trailing down through our breathy and earthy lives, anchoring in the deep waters of our souls. And what that universal chain is she began gasping for breath, worn out, and she couldn't complete her thought. I lifted her shoulders and held the plastic expectoration thing to her mouth and ungnarled her hair on the pillows. Her breath bubbled and stabilized, and I kissed her sweaty forehead. She lifted her hand to cup my neck, so I kissed her again on the cheek. You men, she whispered, leaning back. Oh my goodness, you men. Thank you. I think that's all I have to say for tonight. I apologize for being abrupt, but I thank you for your attention, and I hope you are all keeping your heads, as the saying goes, above water.
Hi, I'm Reverend Matt, and 34 years ago, on June 29th, 1988 to be precise, a young man named Chris Davis stopped on his way home from work in the wee small hours of the morning to change a flat tire. Just as he finished up, he was approached by something. It was, he would later say, humanoid, 7 feet tall, green and wet, with glowing red eyes and 3 fingers on each hand. Well, I'm sure Chris Davis was a good guy, but apparently he judged people based entirely on their appearance. So, he got into his car and was soon driving off at 35 miles per hour. Well, the green entity was untroubled by such speeds and caught up to him and leapt on top of the car and clawed at it. Davis shook it off soon enough and reported the incident to the local sheriff, because who else are you going to report it to, really? I was like 14 years old and 1,000 miles away. And so began the saga of the Bishopville Lizard Man. Now, this was in a field in South Carolina, and some of you may be concluding that it is perhaps not America's #1 hiding place, that perhaps the best place to look for monsters uncatalogued by modern zoology is not out in a field somewhere. But the Bishopville Lizard Man goes by another name. The Lizard Man of Scape or Swamp. Scape or Swamp. As fine a place as any for a monster to hide, and its name, a shortening of its original name, Escaped Horror Swamp. There are a variety of different stories from a variety of different times as to how it came to get this name, all of them involving escaped horrors. Escapes. And there are those who say the lizard person itself is this runaway prostitute mutated and granted centuries of life by mysterious forces. It's as good an explanation as any. Or no, it isn't. In fact, it is a much worse explanation than most. So, let's look at some of the other explanations then. One is, of course, that it is just what it sounds like, a reptilian that has evolved into humanoid form. The main problem with this idea is that it is completely wrong, just as wrong as you might chance upon. And this is mostly a matter of evolution and biophysics. That's right, biophysics. Everybody calm down. The thing about the upright bipedal form that we all enjoy so well is that it has evolved exactly once in hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate history, and this is in part because it is not a majestically efficient body plan. It's bad for the back, it's terrible for the birth canal or egg canal, and it is probably only going to evolve in an animal that is already tailless. If you've already got a nice long reptilian tail, and bipedalism becomes advantageous to you to free the front limbs for grasping or to aid in running or something like that, you're just going to evolve a heavier tail as a counterbalance and end up looking like a dinosaur. And if the Bishopville Lizard Man looked like a dinosaur, well, then we'd have a different set of problems. and a different set of awesome. Some attempt to get around this by stating that the lizard man is a reptoid, a reptilian, or some other exciting title, these being, of course, the race of humanoid reptilians that live underground and take human form and have been running our governments in secret since time immemorial. Obviously, sensible enough, especially since last Thanksgiving when Joe Biden distended his jaw to swallow a whole turkey. But we're going to disallow it as well. It does, I fear, have some biophysical and even political problems, and even then, to make the Bishopville lizard man one of them, proposes that one individual reptoid had some sort of lost weekend. And though we have all done things we regret, including leaving on the cars in the middle of the night, it seems implausible that so tight a control as the reptoids would have to have could allow for such a lapse. So let's look at the subsequent sightings of the lizard man for other explanations. Shortly after Davis's sighting, a creature was seen in the area described as tall, brown, and hairy. Elsewhere, there came another sighting, this one 7 feet tall, black, and hairy. These are typically lumped in with the lizard man, and I don't know where to begin with that. Obviously, we are now dealing with Sasquatch sightings, and so it has been proposed that Davis's sighting describes a Sasquatch that has been covered in green moss or other swamp slime, which is fine, but explaining an unexplained phenomenon with another unexplained phenomenon actually solves nothing, I'm afraid. It is true that Sasquatch is more evolutionarily likely than a lizard man, but until we have one proven, this doesn't actually make things simpler. I mean, maybe the Bishopville lizard man is the larval form of the Loch Ness monster. Does that help? No. It does not. Now, a Sasquatch in South Carolina is not as remarkable as it may seem, Sasquatch-wise. In fact, there are dozens of reports from all over the state, which is a distinction that South Carolina shares with every other state in the Union, save Hawaii, and also with South America, Africa, Australia, and so forth. It's an embarrassment of riches, Sasquatch-wise. Everybody's got one. And this, in a way, is its own problem. They're everywhere, but we can't find them. Everybody's got a wild man, a man of the woods, and there are those who believe that this suggests that this is perhaps a folkloric phenomenon, something that humans are compelled to invent everywhere by our very nature. Or they just exist everywhere, and we are all so dumb. The final major hypothesis as to the identity of the lizard man is that it is a hoax, a fabrication, either that the people reporting it are lying or deluded, or, particularly popular in the lizard man's case, that someone dressed up as the lizard man to scare people away from their farm. And they would have gotten away with it too, say it with me, if not for those meddling kids. I once spoke to a man who claimed to have done this farmer's taxes recently, and that this was an open secret in Bishopville, where they find it rather embarrassing. Which would explain the depressing lack of lizard man swag available when I visited the town. Seriously, I was in town for snow globes, themed homebrews, a lizard man signature fragrance, and all I got was a lousy t-shirt. I apologize, an excellent t-shirt. Now, such claims prove nothing, really. Claiming that you have pulled off a hoax makes you seem clever, whereas claiming you have seen a lizard man makes you seem less so. There's actually better reason to lie about the hoax. But then on the other hand, hoaxing has been proved to exist, whereas lizard men and Sasquatches, not so much. Leading lizard man researcher Lyle Blackburn, I call him leading because he wrote the one book entirely on the subject, which will do it, feels that hoaxing is not the best explanation for the reason that the lizard man has qualities that would be difficult to hoax. The red glowing eyes, the running at 35 miles per hour, and so forth. And if the sightings are taken at 100% perfect face value, this of course is true. But I'm afraid I must propose that if these creatures are real, and that people are therefore being accosted by unknown entities on lonely roads in the dead of night, that, well, maybe these people having the sightings are ice cold. Maybe you can hold a gun to their head and they won't even flinch. Maybe the two little girls in The Shining are adorable to them. But if you see something like this, you are going to get excited and embellish. Anyone would. And the same, I think, would be true if the unknown entity is actually a guy in a lizard suit, which you must admit, at the very least, is not what you were expecting. Don't get me wrong. I have a certain respect for taking witnesses at face value, even if I don't think it leads to excellent results. I don't think there's a biological case for the existence of lizard men, or Sasquatches for that matter. But I do think that many people honestly believe that they have seen these things. How do I reconcile these two things? I don't. I truly don't know the answer. But I do know that these stories make the world weirder. And there is a place where somebody thought they saw a lizard man, and I'm endlessly grateful for that. Thank you.
My publicist, with whom I have had a happy relationship for many years, has lately retired, and I am in the process of training in a very talented and eager young man who, alas, does require a little coaching. Whereas Mrs. Chernovitz was a genuine cosmopolite, able to secure well-remunerated speaking engagements in vast lecture halls in Paris, Tokyo, Cape Town, Salzburg, Chiang Mai, and Cusco, my new publicist, a native of Omaha, has recently sent me on a tour of historical societies and amateur enthusiast meetings throughout the smallest hamlets of Nebraska and Kansas. And though my appearances were in the main very successful, after some weeks of this I began to feel a certain lack of variety. So it was that when Cameron told me I was booked at the Elks Lodge at 422 Main Street, Osawatomie, Kansas, 60 miles outside of Kansas City, I found this a happy circumstance in two ways. First, because it gave me opportunity to spend time with my old friend, Dr. David Buckman of the Kansas City School for Aerospace Engineering and the Performing Arts. And second, because Osawatomie played an important role in the history of what came to be known in the mid-19th century as Bleeding Kansas. One night in May 1856, the abolitionist John Brown and his associates hauled 5 pro-slavery men from their beds and cut them to pieces with broadswords, an event which precipitated increased violence between border ruffians and jayhawks, leading to the looting of the town and its utter incineration on August 30th of that year. I have long been fascinated by Brown. In 2009, my wife and I had visited the site of his historic raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, had seen Brown's guns and pikes, had set foot in the famous Engine House, and had stood on the Appalachian Trail to watch the confluence of the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers at the Blue Ridge Gap, a site Thomas Jefferson once called perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in nature. Accordingly, on this recent trip, Dr. Buckman and I spent a necessary afternoon visiting the John Brown State Historic Site, which contains the log cabin lived in by Brown's half-sister and brother-in-law, assorted other memorabilia, and a life-sized statue of Brown by George Fight Waters, a student of Rodin's, whose other famous public statue of Lincoln I had recently seen at the South Park blocks in Portland, Oregon. Anachronistically but forgivably, Fight Waters' statue depicts Brown with his striking Old Testament beard, which he had not grown until at least a year after the events in Kansas. As well, Dr. Buckman drew my attention to a nearby memorial dedicated to the 5 men murdered by Brown: Partridge, Garrison, Powers, Kaiser, and Frederick Brown, 4 of whom are also buried in the park, although we did not seek out their graves. By then it was time for us to be going to the Elks Lodge, and in any case my eyes seemed itchy, and I had developed a slight cough. A result, Bucky told me, of prairie fires slightly to the south of us, part of a controlled tall grass burn conducted by the Forest Service. My presentation on the economic conditions in the Byzantine Empire under the reign of Justinian II Rhinometus at the turn of the 8th century AD was well received. And afterward, a mixed group of Elks, bikers, and the doctor and I repaired to a nearby bar where we were treated to Rebel, deep-fried pickles, and many pitchers of beer. We were surrounded by hearty, animated men on all sides, and even the owners of the bar came over to greet us. But for some reason, I soon found my well of conversation running dry. Not a common occurrence, to say the least. Fortunately, Dr. Buckman, a fully assimilated Kessen, was able to keep things lively and easy where I could not. At some point in the evening, I found myself dancing with a lovely young lady while Gillian Welch's Silver Dagger played on the jukebox, but nothing occurred that was beyond propriety, I assure you. We made our goodbyes, and Bucky began to drive to our motel, from which he would return to his family in the morning, and I would head to my next appointment in East St. Louis. But after a short while, we pulled over and parked the car. We had crested a low hill, and ahead of us in the distance, we could see that the skyline was alive with fire, a flickering red and yellow line that seemed to cover maybe 20 or 30 degrees of the horizon. Trees and houses stood out in silhouette. Above the flames, appearing and vanishing in the smoke, we could see a helicopter and a searchlight jabbing downward toward the earth. As we watched, a cascade of rust-colored fire retardant poured down, and shortly we heard the rotor blades of another helicopter, and then a third joining the battle. Well, Buck, it seems to have gotten a little out of hand, I said, and he agreed. We lay on the hood of the car, in a way I haven't done since I was a teenager, and covered ourselves with a blanket and smoked something and watched the flames. And Dr. Buckman, whose training is as a poet, but who has long taken an interest in local anthropology, related a curious anecdote. It seems that there is a folk tradition in this part of eastern Kansas, he told me, in which mothers use the name of John Brown to encourage recalcitrant children to go to sleep. If they talked back, Brown would appear together with his 1,000 well-armed sons, and they would chop the children into bits and steal all their slaves. Surely children didn't have many slaves to steal, I said, but he told me it was the spirit of the thing. Here comes old John Brown to burn up the town. Don't you make noise, for he loves to kill boys, and cut their sisters down, and then take everything you own. This doggerel bothered me to an unusual degree. For years, I admit, I have been haunted by sympathy and a guarded admiration for old Osawatomie Brown, and I did not appreciate this transformation of him into some sort of ghastly phantom. Did black families have similar rhymes, I asked him. Not about John Brown, he said, and in any case, the local non-white traditions were attenuated. Osawatomie, like many of the local communities, was over 90% white, a fact I had suspected for some time. I couldn't let it go. It was true that Brown had killed 5 men for no reason other than their reprehensible beliefs. But what should 21st century children have to fear about that, Dr. Buckman? Still, I was being disingenuous, and my friend knew it. John Brown had raised terror wherever he had gone because the hearts of American whites were buckets overfilled with guilt and a deep, dark, slimy horror, and it didn't take all that much to kick them over. Besides, said Bucky, passing me a flask, he's dead and has nothing more to say for himself. If he's still making people afraid after all this time, he probably wouldn't object. Actually, I'd call that a result. The tall grass burned, and we watched a little longer while the helicopters swept the ground with sharp white light, as if they were looking for an escaped prisoner or some loose change they had dropped in the dark. Thank you.
Hi. I'm Reverend Mad, and people called bosses are rarely sympathetic. We are less likely to use that word for people we like. We call those leaders, or perhaps more literally supervisors. It's a fine distinction, and a subtle one, of course, so let us discuss it in terms of my own primary vector of childhood moral instruction, this being, of course, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. This was, of course, a popular cartoon and toy line telling of the adventures of muscular and strangely dressed people on a planet called Eternia. How any of this made them masters of the universe was unrevealed. Perhaps it was some sort of Zen thing that also involved magic swords, as all the best Zen does. If Eternia sounds like a stupid name for a planet, by the way, well, buckle up. The actual hero of this story was actually called He-Man, because apparently what was important about him was gender binaries. His name was as masculine as those of Macho Man Randy Savage or Dick Butkus, and yet almost Hemingway-esque in its economy. For all this, though, his depiction in the cartoon is surprisingly gentle. He was a warm, kind man, almost gentle and unassuming, simply doing what he must and accepting assistance where he could. Indeed, his secret identity was Prince Adam, royalty, you understand, and yet he kept his lordship hidden to do his work that was more heroic and also more tanned and shirtless. Contrast this, then, with Skeletor, his arch-nemesis. Skeletor's head was a hooded skull, like the very angel of death itself, and then below this, he was a largely naked purple muscle man. And the artists of antiquity, of hooded, side-bearing death, of the exterminating angel Azrael, could only look down from heaven and weep at the inferiority of their own work. More important than this, though, He-Man had friends, whereas Skeletor had lackeys. Chief among them were Beastman, an urbane sophisticate, Trapjaw, who had a jaw, never mind, and Evil Lyn, whose name was a play on Evelyn, only with the word evil in it. Did everybody get that? Have you taken a moment to bask in the almost Wildian wordplay? Good. Good. We'll continue. Other Skeletor lackeys included Twoobad, T-W-O-B-A-D, who had two heads that constantly squabbled among themselves, Clawful, an evil fiddler crab man, Stinkor, an evil skunk man, and Ninjor, an evil, oh, forget it. If all this sounds ridiculous, please understand that it is. It sure is. The basic boss-employee dynamic here is that Skeletor is abusive towards those he supervises, and then they are incompetent, go to 10. Which is to say, repeat forever for those of you who have never had a Commodore 64. I looked up the Commodore 64 upon thinking of it here and learned that it had 64 kilobytes of memory. And of course, if you now offer me a backup memory stick with less than literally 1,000,000 times this memory, I will punch you in the face. Anyway. Skeletor and his personnel were locked in a forever loop, Stinkor and company never meeting their annual goals, and Skeletor never encouraging morale. It's easy enough to imagine why Skeletor didn't fire them. He can only have a rough time with recruitment, what with the abuse and the constant losses to the shirtless man. One wonders why his people even stayed on, though. Perhaps he had an excellent 401k. This cycle was very common among Skeletor's contemporaries. On the planet Thundera, presumably in the same sector as Eternia, a sector where, by some unexpected circumstance of planetary discovery, all of the planets got to be named by 5-year-olds hopped up on Cocoa Puffs. There was Mum-Ra, who had come to Thundera from ancient Egypt or something. These people actually have remarkably complicated and often contradictory backstories, which I'm going to spare you, though I will mention that in one version of Skeletor's origin, he is He-Man's uncle. This is thought to have been an aping of Darth Vader being Luke Skywalker's father, and so much as the Star Wars family dynamic reflects the ages-old heroic story of a son overcoming his father who obstructs him, so too does He-Man reflect the ages-old story structure of a nephew overcoming his uncle. Mum-Ra fights the Thundercats, of course, not the other kind of cats, with the aid of his mutants, who are a variety of human-animal hybrids, and hence evil, unlike, of course, the Thundercats themselves, who are human-animal hybrids that are cats, and that is beautiful and natural. The mutants, in any case, are incompetent, and Mum-Ra treats them badly forever and ever, world without end. Amen. The exact relationship between Mum-Ra and the mutants is never really specified, whether they regard him as a noble or an employer, or perhaps a religious figure, we don't know. The villain boss in the less well-remembered Thundercats parallel series Silverhawks actually has a more explicit role, being a sort of mob boss. This being because the Silverhawks themselves are spacefaring cyborg policemen, described as partly metal, partly real, because metal, as we know, doesn't exist. Their nemesis was an alternately bestial and metallic crime lord called Monstar, a portmanteau of monster and star. Do you get it? No? No? That's actually fine. He rides on a giant space squid, and here at last we have a boss whose employee retention I understand. I am joining up with the organization that has giant space squid you can ride on immediately. I'm not even giving 2 weeks' notice to my current employer. One of his employees is actually named Yes Man, but then I suppose naming conventions have been a little on the nose, haven't they? If few remember the Silverhawks, fewer still remember the underwater completion of the awesome animal people triad, the Tiger Sharks, and those who do remember them will rarely admit it. Here the heroes were such people as Walro, Dolph, and Bronk, which actually isn't that obvious, except he's a seahorse, and frankly, I would have preferred just Seahorseor. Their villain is T-Ray, served by such incompetents as Walleye, Shad, and Weakfish. And this all happens on the planet Water-O, and no, that is where I draw the line. This is my hill, and I will die on it. Water-O! Now, my own favorite 1980s cartoon monster boss comes from the series Brave Star. Set on the planet of New Texas, not a great name, but heartbreakingly beautiful compared to the apparent average. This starred Marshall Bravestar, a lawman of indigenous American heritage, whose mentor was a man named Shaman, also indigenous American, but named after a Siberian term, who taught Bravestar the powers of eyes of the hawk, ears of the wolf, strength of the bear, and speed of the puma. This is what passed for progressivism in those days, though of course what passes for progressivism now is often hardly breathtaking. I do like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Sometimes I even have a crush on her, which is hardly appropriate for a woman of her standing, but here we are. Moving on. Bravestar was a sort of space western like Firefly, but did Firefly have robotic talking horses? No, it did not. Its primary villain was an undead or undeadish gunslinger called Tex Hex, and that's fine, but Tex Hex worked for another large entity, a huge misshapen horror with a cow skull head who would rise up out of mists in a deep cave to give Hex his orders. This creature's name was Stampede, and it actually had a tiny bit of power, a bit of scariness, at least to a 10-year-old. It was almost Lovecraftian, at least to a 10-year-old, except for the part where it lived on a planet called New Texas, and then there was a robot horse. Still, his employees were incompetent, and he was mean to them, and order remained in the universe. Of course, my real favorite inhuman evil boss from 1980s cartoons is Genghis Rex, leader of the Tyrannos in Dinosaucers, another cartoon that nobody remembers, and in this case, certainly in large part because it was so bad. But it was about dinosaur people from space, and that was all I wanted in the 1980s, all I want now, and all I ever will want. My time draws to a close tonight, alas, so I cannot give the Dinosaucers the attention they deserve. But if you would like to hear more about them, please contact me at any time. Literally any time. Call me at 3:30 in the morning. I am and will be ready. But for now, my nickel is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt Kessen. Matt Kessen, everyone. Matt, where can these fine folks see you for the rest of the weekend?
Well, in 1 hour, they can see me on main stage doing a new Reverend Matt's Monster Science called the nearest, what's it called? I don't know what it's called, but it's about alternate dimensions. The nearest convenient alternate dimension. Parallel dimension, thank you. Yeah, so that's main stage at 7 o'clock tonight, and then I'm doing another full-length Monster Science. Friendly Neighborhood Spider Monsters at Cinema Rex tomorrow at 2 o'clock.
All right, thank you. And if anybody wants to see me at 2 o'clock tomorrow, I'll be signing books in the main auditorium area, I believe. And so thank you all for coming. Before you leave, I'm going to send you off with a very short lullaby. I wish you a happy con. This is called Things Your Child Was Not Meant to Know. Come hither, my child, and hearken to me, and we will enrich your vocabulary. Old Grandpa Tybalt respects not your darents, nor the mindless objections of idiot parents. A is for crumbling, witch-haunted Arkham. B for Brown Jenkin, the vermin homunculum. C for Cthulhu and the chaos that crawls. D is for Dagon and deep ones and dulls. E is for Aimon and the Vale of Panath. F for the fungi from frigate Yoggoth. G is for ghouls and the grave sites they rob. H is for Howards, both Lovecraft and Bob. I is for Innsmouth in fishy seclusion. J for von Munst on a sprechlichen Kulten. K for the wasteland of Chile, Kadath. And L for Lost Lang, the plateau without path. M for the mysteries Miskatonic men bury. N for Necronomicon in its secret library. O for the old ones, the great gods who rule you. P for the Nuriai Nishanathwa Cthulhu. Q for a question. What have I forgotten? R is the answer. Willianaga Satagan. S for the Shoggoths and the shapes they change freely. And T for their terrible Tekalili. U is for Ulthar, where the cats are untouchable. V for Sign Voorish, to watch the unwatchable. W for Wilbur and old Wizard Whately. X the xenogenic twin, unseen lately. Y for Yog Sothoth, Yohannathwai, Yig. And Z for the Zoos, who don't grow very big. That's all for tonight, but there's more, so much more, that lurks neath the bed and claws at the door. So sleep now, my child, and stifle your screams. And may the great old ones grant you great old sweet dreams.